introductions? Yes, all right. We are recording. Welcome to our topic webinar brought to you by NSD Debate. My name is Chris Castillo. I am the LD coach at Straight Jesuit, and I also direct NSD Flagship with Jasmine. And I also direct NSD Texas. To introduce our panelists today, first we have Rose Larson. Rose debates at the University of Kansas, where she is without a doubt one of the top five debate teams in the country, her and her partner. She won the largest major tournament of the year so far, Wake Forest. She is also an LD coach at Lake Highland, where she has coached champions and finalists at several major national tournaments, including tournaments like Harvard, Lexington, etc. She historically has taught the second lab at Flagship and the top lab at NSD Texas. Next, we have Jasmine Stidham, who is a coach at Michigan State University. In her free time, she also assists with Straight Jesuit. As a coach, she has twice coached NDT champions and has coached multiple TOC finalists. As a debater, she was twice in the top 16 at the NDT. She is also directs the flagship with me and leads our top lab. So without any further ado, Jasmine, you can take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, Castillo. Hey, everyone. It's so great to have you all here, especially nice seeing some familiar names in the chat and everything from camp. As forementioned, this is going to be an advanced strategy discussion / overview of the nuclear weapons topic as it's been debated thus far, along with some predictions and pro tips for future tournaments with an emphasis on, some of the national championships such as NDCA and the TOC. There will be a ton of time at the end for questions. So if you have questions, please write them down. You can also put them in the chat, but just know that like Rose and I will not really be monitoring the chat. Castillo will be, but you might want to save some of your questions like for the end. But please have a lot of questions. That will make this all the better. Before we jump in, though, we are going to talk about debating online this weekend, and we're going to give you some pro tips because Emory just shifted online, and I have to guess that most of you are competing at it. If you're not, maybe this won't apply to you, but maybe it applies for you at a future online tournament. And a lot of you have not debated at a fully online tournament in a minute, so we just want to give you some pro tips for that. So the first is that you need to have good headphones and ideally a mic if you have one. Please, please, please do not use AirPods. I know that they're extremely convenient and like comfortable, but the audio quality is usually not so great, and that affects your speaker points and just the ability for the judge to like get all of your arguments down. I would highly recommend against not using AirPods and just try to use a good set of headphones. If you have like a gamer headset, those are honestly the best because they usually have a built-in mic that sounds pretty crisp. Next is that you need to test your Wi-Fi and your connection speed. You might be like, oh, do I really need to do this? Yeah, you should do this if you have not done this ever, because if your Wi-Fi is really bad this weekend, then you're going to have a lag, you're going to cut out, you might drop out, and you just might not even realize that your connection speed is not what it needs to be. You should try to have a hotspot as a backup. If that's your phone, great. Otherwise, try to talk to, your teammates, your coach or something to see if this is something that you could arrange. But having a hotspot, I think, will be really key, especially if you're in one of the areas of the country this weekend that's going to be hit with a lot of snow and bad weather. To keep your laptop like running properly, you need to make sure that you like close tabs and like run updates. Like if your Mac has been bugging you to update your OS, you should do that. That applies to me for sure. And also like your Word and all of that. Otherwise, those are things that cause your laptop to slow down, and that can affect your audio quality and just everything. You should have a plan with your coach and your teammates for pre-round prep. You should, have a PEMDAS sort of system where like what you're going to do once pairings come out instead of just like panicking, whether that's using Discord or using Slack, like the Slack huddle feature. You should just have a plan before the tournament starts. Additionally, you need to slow down overall. I think a good way to think about this is reducing your speed by about like 15%. And a lot of students are unfortunately going to ignore this, but I really hope you don't, because you should really be trying to make it easier for the judge to catch all of your arguments. And it's really hard to do that online. Judging online is often harder, especially when you're reading, your scripted doc, as fast as you possibly can. Judges are going to miss more things than they do in person. So it is highly recommended to just slow it down a little bit. Maybe take out one shell, just one shell. Next, you should always double check that your judge and your opponent are ready. Just because you think the judge is back or your opponent are back, if their cameras are not on, you need to make sure like you get a verbal and audible confirmation from them, so that way you don't start when your judge is like still doing something else. You should record your speeches. This is the most important thing, honestly. And if I were you to remind yourself, I would put like a post-it note on my laptop or something that reminds yourself to record your speeches. There will be speeches this weekend that drop, like debates that get, cut out. Your judge drops because they have a bad connection and they have to like rejoin NSDA campus. You need to record your speeches. It will make your life easier, and it ensures that, you are not left in a situation where, you just thought you were giving a speech to a whole room full of people, and turns out that you weren't. So make sure you record your speeches. Keep your camera on if you can. Judges should as well. And if you can't, just like let your judge know that you can't have your camera on, so that way they're aware of that. And then again, connecting back to the first point on the slide, go for fewer arguments overall. Judges are much more likely to miss arguments online. And so you can cut against that by just going for slightly fewer arguments. All right, those are our tips. And with that, let's get into it. This is our resolution, in case you didn't know. Hopefully you know this by now and have it memorized. I'm going to cover a lot of the policy and a lot of the critical ground, not all of it. And then Rose will be taking much more of the fill side of the topic as well as theory. All right, some big picture thoughts on the rest of the season. There are only a handful of major bid tournaments left. We've got Emory this weekend, we have Stanford, we have the Berkeley/Harvard weekend, a couple of other smaller bid tournaments in between, but those are the majors. And then we have NDCA and the TOC. There's still a lot of room for topic innovation. If you think that the topic has like already been exhausted for the most part, that is not the case. There's a lot more that we could be saying, and we're going to talk about those arguments. And then if you're serious about the NDCA and the TOC tournaments, you should start your planning process now. That doesn't mean like start cutting everything now, but it means like start thinking about it a little bit more. Don't wait until March, to start your TOC prep. The first step is to gather intel so you can get a big picture of which parts of the topic have not been explored yet. Even if you've been debating a bunch, maybe you've been debating only, on the East Coast or the West Coast or what may have you. You should, again, try to gather as much intel as you can to get a really complete sense of what the topic is thus far, because there's a chance that you might have missed something. All right, for policy apps thus far, there isn't like one app that clearly dominates the circuit, which I think is really interesting. The most common affirmatives so far include, we got some whole res apps, of course, and with this includes like, hard right policy apps that have like extinction impacts, and then like soft left affirmatives that defend, topical action and all of that, but have critical impacts. We have some US focused apps. We have a good amount of Russia apps, Iran, North Korea, France, India, and Pakistan. And within those areas, there are apps that specify particular types of nukes. So there's like, the Poseidon app or like ICBMs. Again, this is not like every single policy app, but it's like a big picture of what people have been reading thus far. In terms of advantage ground that we can see on the policy apps that have been read thus far, even though the topic seems kind of big because it doesn't specify, a country or anything like that, the policy advantage ground is actually like pretty small and it's not that diverse. So you can categorize a lot of the advantage ground into these categories, which is like one, crisis stability, accidents/miscalc, kind of the same thing. Nuclear arms racing, which has a lot of overlap with prolif, but they're not exactly the same. And then apps that are like conventional shift good. But what I've seen after looking through so many docs this past week is that a lot of AF internal links end up having too much overlap. They end up being not strategic. For example, when I'm looking at 1ACs that have like an accidents internal link and a like misinformation internal link, while those are technically different, they end up sounding the same because both internal links are about like unintentionally starting nuclear conflict. So that might seem like a small thing, but it kind of matters when you're doing like strategic 1AC construction, especially for like the most competitive tournaments of the year. And you're just kind of like wasting precious 1AC time if you're not reading like the most diverse internal links to give yourself like the, best advantage that you can. In terms of soft left apps, this topic is great for apps with a framing page, like really, really good. I would encourage you to look into this if you're someone who has not been reading one of these apps, thus far. It's really strategic, really, really strategic, even if you're like ideologically not a fan of them. The most common soft left apps so far on this topic are like feminist IR apps, ones about like, hegemonic masculinity and the way that, nukes are part of that. There's a lot of like neo-colonialism or just regular colonialism. Of course, we have settler colonialism. I've seen a few apps like that. There are anti-blackness apps that focus a lot on like race IR that I've seen. And then we've seen a lot of nuclear poetics apps. And if you went to Flagship this summer, you definitely remember this. And that's been like pretty popular as well. All right, what every good affirmative must have. So strategic 1ACs are built to answer the best 1NCs. Strategic elements of policy apps on this topic should include the following. First, as we had just talked about, diverse internal links that don't overlap. Make them different, make them unique, force the 1NC to answer each and every one separately so they can't just group them. You also should try to have at least one impact scenario that doesn't end in nuclear war. And I know that might seem like kind of hard because, it's a nukes topic after all. But again, it's not that hard to find a non-nuclear war terminal impact. For example, you could even read just like a warming impact or something. There are other like health related impacts out there that you could still get to extinction with, but you should try to have something that isn't just nuclear war. Additionally, you need to have built-in answers to NFU and D-Alert. Those are core counterplans that everyone's been reading. You all have probably have had debates on these like already, hopefully. But your 1AC needs to have built-in answers to it as to why NFU and D-Alert do not solve, because that is like the functional limit on this topic, basically. You should have at least one uniqueness trick, like an inevitability argument about the inevitability of nuclear war or something, or like collapse of X state is coming now. Like in the context of the Russia app, you could have like collapse of like Putin's regime is coming now, ergo nuclear war, the risk of it is higher than it's ever been. Like something like that that you can use to frame out a lot of disads and a lot of case arguments. You should also have epistemology indites of deterrence theory. Now, epistemology is often a word that gets thrown around in like K debates, and you might be like, what? Like, what's that doing here? Epistemology also applies like when you're reading a policy argument. Epistemology just means like how we know what we know. And so you should have some cards, at least one card in the 1AC that's like pointing out the flaws in deterrence theory overall, because that will help you answer a lot of different arguments, not just like the deterrence like disadvantage. And we can talk more about like what those look like. For example, there are lots of like authors out there who will give like a laundry list indite of all the major like neg think tanks essentially who write like pro deterrence articles like over and over again. That would be something that falls in this category. Next is that you want to have some EV that speaks to possession and not just use. Hopefully we're all like there already and this isn't like brand new information, but you got to have evidence that is actually using the language of possession and not just use. Not only for T reasons, but also for Phil reasons that I think Rose will get into in a bit. You also need to have some AF-specific evidence for like an IR theory that explains your case. So for example, if you are defending an affirmative that is about like offensive realism or something, you should have evidence in your 1AC that is talking about that and validating that as a theory. That can be really strategic against the K, can be really strategic against disads, right? It's like your theory of power essentially when you're AF on this topic. So having like AF specific evidence, whether that's like for the Russia AF or for, the North Korea AF or whatever, you want to have something that backs up the main thing that you're talking about, something that talks about IR theory. Next, I think you got to have evidence from 2024 and beyond. When I was looking through a lot of docs this past week, I was seeing a lot of old evidence. And I know that, there are a lot of people who don't bring it up in debates, so like you can probably get away with a lot of it. But if you're really trying to go deep at the TOC, like these are the little things that can really matter in close, like high level debates. And so if you don't have evidence that assumes like Trump 2.0 or the Ukraine invasion or other like recent events, I think you're gonna, have a hard time because if your opponent is up to date on those things and they have evidence that assumes all of those things, it's just gonna be really hard for you to win on like evidence comparison alone. So try to make sure that you have the most recent evidence for the things that matter. Obviously, there are, things like maybe terminal impact cards and stuff like that, where you don't need to have like the most recent card, but for every other part of the app, like you kind of do. All right, some big picture thoughts on the policy negs thus far. These are all arguments that are kind of the bread and butter for this topic. So I'm not saying anything like mind blowing. We got the deterrence disad, CBWs like bioweapons and stuff, hypersonics, an IRK, which can include a lot of different types of like IR critiques, the D alert counterplan, NFU, and then T subsets, of course. When you're prepping your neg arsenal for the TOC, I think you got to have the following in like your neg toolbox. The first is that you have just got to get good at whole res slash no subsets. I think a lot of you are already there, which is great, but you need to like do even more of that work. Like you should be able to like go for this in your sleep essentially, because you will have to go for this at some point at the TOC. Someone will break new and it will be a subset and you got to be ready. And you also need to have like different interps for like the different types of subsets. So like you can say like, oh, you can't specify a country or like you can't specify a different type of like weapon. There are different ways to modularize those interps. But that file of yours needs to be like perfect. There are a lot of files you can go into the TOC with where like they don't have to be perfect, but like this is one of those that's like the highest ROI in my opinion. Next is like T possession. It doesn't seem like there's been a lot of like T possession debates going down based on the docs that I've seen. But as we'll talk about in a bit, when I start talking about predicting future AFs, T possession I think will have much more of a role to play in certain debates versus new affirmatives. The next is the deterrence disad, of course. But you need to make sure that you have links and impact scenarios for all 9 like countries that are like the nuclear weapon states. If you don't have like cards for all those countries, you're going to be in trouble if you debate one of those affirmatives and you're not going to have a real deterrence disad. You can't read like the US version of the deterrence disad versus like the North Korea AF. You need to have at least one process counter plan that's like versatile enough for all like 9 countries. So oftentimes that could be, something like consult. Sometimes it can just be something else that's even like more cheaty. It could be like an agent thing. It could be like ICJ. There's a lot of different things you could do, but you should have one process counter plan that could, reasonably apply to all of the nuclear weapon states for the possible topical AFs. Next, you got to have an IRK and you got to have something that has like a diverse link toolbox to different countries and advantage areas. So like feminist IR, I'm a little biased, but like I think that one is a winner because it does cover all of the bases that you would need for this topic, or something that's like about like racial IR, like CRT, that kind of thing. Really, really good on this topic. Those cards like fall from the sky. Next, you got to have an NFU counterplan with different modules. The nice thing about like NFU is that there are cards and articles out there for like all the countries that we're concerned with for this topic. So it's not hard to build like an NFU like file. If you haven't started that yet, you can easily do this. You got to have like at least a couple of new picks versus whole res apps. There will be teams who, will break new, but they are probably, there are a lot of teams who are averse to topicality, which means that they are going to break new whole res like apps with like different scenarios. And you should try to just have a couple of like new picks for that. And that could look like a lot of things, but just in general, if I were you, I would always go into the TOC having like at least 2, maybe 3 new picks. Next is that you should try to have some like politics disads or elections disads for non-US countries. So for example, like Japan or like South Korea, like I would be cutting those like personally, if I was like going into the TOC on this topic, because even if like the app is just like US focused, or if it's even whole res, like those types of politics disads like Japan and South Korea would absolutely apply, because our nuclear like weapons in the US and like our nuclear like sharing agreements and our nuclear umbrella with those countries absolutely implicates like their political sphere and their elections. There are lots of cards on that, trust me. Next is that you want to have an advantage counter plan, like a toolbox with like different planks and modules that you can just kind of like easily move in and out of depending on what the AF is. So again, that can look like NFU and dealer, and then also having, something there like hotlines or something. There's so many different possibilities here, but like have a nice crisp advantage counter plan that has lots of different planks to solve all the internal links that we talked about on like the AF slide. All right. Being neg when you're prepping the critique. So hopefully everyone can go for at least one critique. If that's not the case for you, if I were you, I would work on that before the TOC. Even if you're someone who doesn't love critiques, they're not your favorite argument, it doesn't matter. They are simply strategic, and you need to have one on this topic. Otherwise, you're just kind of doing yourself like a disservice. And no matter what K you're going for, whether that's like, settler colonialism, whether it's anti-blackness, whether it's psychoanalysis, whatever, you need to get deep on IR theory. So you need to have links and lots of cards about realism or constructivism and liberal internationalism, the main IR theories, right? Because again, strategic AFs like will say, well, it doesn't matter, what the K thinks in terms of IR, because realism is true, and we have lots of cards that say this is how states work. And so your K file needs to have cards on all of those theories. I think a strategic K on this topic will include links about the AF's IR theory, and importantly, a case strategy that is consistent with your IR theory. So what I mean by that is that if you're up here being like realism is like racist and gendered, but then like you're reading a bunch of cards on case that are also like using realism, or they're coming from a bunch of like conservative like think tanks that clearly think that realism is true, or and that we need to deter more, like that's going to get you in trouble in terms of like perfcon and all of the framework offense that you want to go for. So you need to build a case strategy that's consistent with whatever IR theory that your K is kind of going for. You got to have links to like, but X countries are worse. So, like Russia and China are worse, or whatever that may be. Usually that's the most common one that people say. So you have to have links to that. And there are cards, and there is literature about those things out there. You should have links to like conventional shift. So like, or AFs that are like, oh, we need to get rid of nukes so we can make this part of our triad better, right? Those cards also fall from the sky. Like it's not hard to find those cards, and makes winning the link very, very easy. Like I would prep to go for the K versus those types of affirmatives. You also need to have links to disarmament. Even AFs that defend kind of like a soft left version of disarmament will still link. There are lots of cards out there for us. You can, find those cards on the wiki or logos or whatever. But you got to have some links to disarm. And then you, of course, need to have a toolbox with links to core advantage areas and countries. So like all the major players that have nuclear weapons, and then the core advantage areas. Like there are links to miscalc. There are links to nuclear accidents out there. If you haven't found them, this is your note to self to go do some of that research, because I promise you that they are out there. All right, when you're prepping versus soft left AFs, and you're trying to go for like some policy arguments, here are the things that I would prep if I were you. The first and the most important, honestly, is a big advantage counter plan that includes different planks like nuclear reparations, or banning nuclear testing, or funding for like cleanup projects, etc. All of those things are going to severely like mitigate the weight of the case in those debates. The next is that you want to have conventional shift ready to go with specific turns case arguments versus structural violence impact. So for example, if I'm neg versus a FemIR type AF, I'm definitely going to read conventional shift, and I'm going to read like arguments and cards about how conventional shift, conventional weapons are worst for like, violence against like feminized populations and all that jazz. You should have some nuclear consequentialism good on case, because I think what's tricky sometimes about debating soft-lived AFs is that they can often like shift a little bit in terms of how they explain the affirmative and whether or not they are like just upholding the resolution as like, a moral obligation, or if they're kind of like getting consequentialist, like fiated based offense. And so you should have like at least one card or two on like nuclear consequentialism good. So that way they have to like, answer that and take a stance. You should have a spec argument, like must spec which nukes, or like must spec the disarm process. I think Rose is going to talk more about some theory stuff, but like you should definitely have that in like your neg arsenal versus soft left apps, because it's harder for them to K that. You should also have a pick that links the least to the AF specific framing. So like if it's, gosh, like a like a FemIR AF again, or rather nuclear poetics or something, you want to find a pick where they can just like where they can K it the least. So like I would maybe say versus a nuclear poetics AF, like, oh, we need to maintain this type of nuke to deter Russia because they are obviously invading Ukraine and doing massive amounts of like genocidal violence in Ukraine. And like that, directly implicates and turns the app's framing. So finding something like that where you have inroads to their types of impacts. You should also consider cutting some like nukes good for the global south. Those cards exist, and those can be kind of tough for the app to answer. And if you need more help, finding those sites, I'm happy to help you out, but I promise that they exist. And then also, you should always know that a lot of these apps, while they're very strategic and good, they also suffer from like alt causes that you can exploit. So a lot of the times they will have like the 1AC evidence will not just be talking about nuclear weapons, but will also be talking about conventional war or about like militarism broadly. But the affirmative cannot topically solve all of those things. So being able to read your opponent's evidence and being able to like strategically highlight it to demonstrate that they don't solve all of those things, I think can get you kind of far on case, even if you don't have a lot of cards yourself. So you should, again, note to self, soft left AFs often have a lot of alt causes within their own evidence. If you want to prep the NFU counterplan versus apps like these, there are a lot of K authors who shout out to NFU and they think NFU is good. So that can be another like easy thing to prep. And as I've been kind of yapping about for a while, you need to robustly defend your IR theory. So like you need to have good realism cards, you need to have good constructivism cards, right? Because these AFs, like the good ones, are built to K whatever thing that you are defending. So you got to be ready to defend yours. All right, predicting some future AFs. So a lot of times, like people ask, like like Jasmine, how do I know what new apps people are going to break? Like how do I get inside their head? But it's a lot easier than you think. First is that you should take a look at the map of which countries have nukes, and I have that here for you. So we've got the US, UK, France, Israel, Pakistan, India, China, North Korea, Russia. Earlier, we talked about the main apps that have been broken so far, and there are some countries on this map that where we have not seen apps broken about it thus far. So that's probably your first indication of like where teams are going to go in the future for new apps that nobody has read before. The next is that you should be mining, I almost hate saying this, but you should be mining the college wiki from 23, 24, not to steal all of those things. You should cut your own EV, you should do your own work, but you should use it for inspiration. That's called just being smart and being prepared, because other teams are definitely going to do this. So go there, make sure that you mine all that stuff so you have a complete picture of what arguments teams are likely to break. Then you should collect unique definitions of nukes and think about how those could be used for a new AF. As we talked about earlier, a lot of teams have only like really practiced going for T subsets, and they haven't really had to go for a lot of other T arguments. And so you could just like pop a team by catching them off guard if they have not like thought about like T nuclear weapons, if you could find creative definition in an AF that goes with that. Next is that you should think about what the resolution doesn't specify, hint, hint. For example, the resolution does not specify states, and I'll give you some examples of what that looks like on the next slide. Fifth, get creative with mechanisms. Like you don't just have to defend like regular schmegular disarm. Like you can defend like a specific like treaty potentially. Like you could defend a specific type of disarmament forum or mechanism, that kind of thing. So I encourage you to look there for some of your AF innovation. All right, some examples of future AFs. First is that you could see a NATO AF, something where like a plan looks like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's possession of nuclear weapons is immoral. Now, that might run into some problems with T possession, but it could easily throw a team off for at least one round and you can get like a big win potentially. The reason why I say it might run into problems with like T possession is because like you could say that NATO does not possess the nuclear weapons themselves, but rather like it's made up of the nuclear weapons of other countries like the US. And so, yeah, I can get into that more later. But again, I think you could write that 1AC and that 1AR to T in a way where you can get out of that and get a big win. The next one is definitely one that I would write if I was in a different situation. I would write one about terrorist groups. The possession of nuclear weapons by terrorist groups is immoral. The res doesn't specify states. Take advantage of that. Like, why not? Now, this is what we call a one and done F, and so it's not gonna, last you for many rounds. But again, like when you're prepping for the TOC and you're like really trying to win several big debates, like these are the types of strategies that you kind of have to think about to break them against very particular teams. All right, prepping for the TOC, some final notes for me before I kick it over to Rose is that you need to have some new arguments to break, of course, but that shouldn't come at the expense of mastering core topic arguments. The debaters who often do the best at the TOC are not just the ones who have the most new stuff like already ready, to go, but they just like know the topic really, really well, which is how they're able to like sound good while breaking new. So don't break new for the sake of breaking new. Like have a reason, have an intention behind it. I know I sound like a broken record, but like truly, like you need to get really good at an IRK and just like T. Like that is how you will survive the new AFs. You should think about your prep in terms of buckets. You've got your soft left bucket, the fill bucket, the non-T KAF bucket, which isn't that big this year on this topic, whole res policy AF, and then non-whole res policy AF. So like divide your prep there and then think about what you need for each bucket. And then for those debaters who are kind of expecting or hoping to be in TOC elims, all of your like new stuff that you're breaking needs to be around very specific contingencies. So like your prep needs to be like, okay, like in prelims, once we get to rounds, 5 and 6, if I'm AF against this team, like what would I break? Or let's say we're in quarters and I'm, AF against this type of debate. Like you just need to think about it in terms of those buckets and plan around very specific contingencies. Don't just break it because it's like, well, I'm AF, it's round 3, might as well. Because that's just, kind of not being super thoughtful about your strategy. All right, that's what I got from me. Oh, approve. I'm confirming Rose. Oh, 1 second, Rose. I am letting you have control. All right.
All right. I'm not quite sure I can control the slideshow, but that's okay. We can communicate that pretty easily between the two of us. All right. I'm going to talk about fill and theory debate on this resolution and the way it's played out so far this semester in my eyes and directions that we can take in the future. I want to emphasize that I especially agree with the necessity for learning how to go for topicality. I'm going to kind of go on my own little ramble about the fact that words have meanings. But as far as it stands, it's a pretty important tool in your toolbox, especially if are a more policy style person. You don't really have um, the resources available to like deal with every possible new affirmative. Jasmine, I no longer have a slideshow. Hold on.
Yes, one moment.
Okay,
Sorry.
no problem.
All right. And yeah, I'll
All
click
right,
away.
sounds good. So let's get started with the first slide. Um, I cannot control the slideshow. Okay, there we go. I'm going to start with this slide because this is the word you all hear in philosophy debates, I think, pretty often. And it's kind of become a pretty important part of what Phil apps are saying they do when affirming the resolution. And we're going to define the word really quickly and then talk about kind of how this has become a mishap for, I think, both sides as far as debating philosophical positions. So the definition that I have here says intrinsic means belonging to the essential nature or constitution of something. So notably, if a property is intrinsic to an entity, that means there's no version of that entity that can exist without that property. So, for example, I might say that, being born with the heart is intrinsic to being a living human being. Like if you're not born with the heart, you're not a living human being because typically you wouldn't last particularly long. And it's something that's absolutely essential for your flourishing, and you could not exist without it. Similarly, if you wanted to approach it from a more linguistic perspective, if I were to say being unmarried is an intrinsic feature of being a bachelor, what I'm saying is you can't be a bachelor without being unmarried. That's just what that word means. There's something about the definition, the essential characteristics of an object that make it inseparable from this property. Now, when you hear this term in field debates, generally the app is saying X is intrinsic to nuclear weapons. Y is not intrinsic to nuclear weapons, etc. So on the next slide, I kind of have some examples of things that we're claiming are intrinsic reasons nuclear weapons are bad. So I'm going to give you a few examples and then another set of examples, and we'll discuss the differences. So I think we should be able to get pretty easy answers to this. Is deterrence an intrinsic feature of the possession of nuclear weapons? Clearly not. One can have a nuclear weapon and not use it to deter anyone, and one can have a nuclear weapon that doesn't have the effect of deterring anyone either. Similarly, weapons do not intrinsically increase aggression. It's possible that as a consequence they might, or that's a thing that comes up in the course of having nuclear weapons. But there's nothing about being a nuclear weapon that means that it's going to increase your aggression. Similarly, saying that there are other alternatives, not an intrinsic feature of nuclear weapons, nor does it really mean that the possession of nuclear weapons are moral. So the point of all of this is these are all things that non-consequentialist Phil affirmatives are saying are reasons to vote for them. And I think they all sort of fail this intrinsicness test. Like if you really think about it and you sit and puzzle and say, hey, could I have a nuclear weapon without any of these things? The answer is certainly yes. Now, that's not intrinsically a problem, because look at these next three examples. Deterrence will break down and escalate in India-Pakistan. Is that intrinsic to the possession of nuclear weapons? Obviously, no. But no one really cares that it's not. Similarly, US nuclear weapons key to maintaining alliances, not intrinsic to the possession of nuclear weapons, but similarly, no one really cares. And to me, I think the relevant distinction is that policy apps don't claim to have an advantage that's intrinsic to the possession of nuclear weapons. They're making a consequentialist claim that says, hey, the world would be a better place if people didn't have nuclear weapons. And maybe that's not inherent to nuclear weapons, but it's true. And so you should vote affirmative. Uh, and so they have no problem claiming advantages that are not intrinsic to the possession of nuclear weapons. But if you're a Phil debater and your whole story to answer negative disadvantages is, well, none of these things are really proved that possession of nuclear weapons is immoral because consequences fail and, we should only care about the constitutive features of an action or any of the, kind of Phil buzzword phrases you hear to answer disadvantages. You better be pretty sure that the things that you're saying are intrinsic to nuclear weapons actually are. And so as we go to the next slide, I think it'll become clear how we approach, like how the approach to this really shapes the Phil app. So in the face of that, I think you really got two options. And I've seen both of these done, and I would like to see one of them done more. But the first is you can have offense that is just intrinsic to the possession of nuclear weapons. One good example of this is a version of the Kant affirmative that's just reading basically pacifism offense. So it's arguing that weapons are always immoral or always coercive. And those are about as intrinsic of a criticism of nuclear weapons as you get. It's what the word weapon means. You can't have a non-violent weapon. That's almost definitionally entailed by the terms that are in the resolution. So this is one possible solution, is if you are like, you really want to hammer it home that none of the negatives offense is intrinsic to possessing nuclear weapons and they're just consequences, then write an app that your offense lines up with that, read some definitions of weapon in the 1AC, say weapons are always bad. You could approach this a couple different ways, but this really seems the most straightforward way. Similarly, if you're negative and you want offense that is not just a consequentialist defense of why nuclear weapons might be good or bad pragmatically, definition of possession, or maybe not like a dictionary definition, but like a set of moral philosophy that tells us how we should approach issues regarding when you can or cannot have something. So like moral philosophy of property, the work of people like Locke, Hobbes, Kant, those people all have something to say about under what conditions you can ethically possess something. And that might also be intrinsic to the resolution because there's nothing about, it's irrelevant whether a nuclear weapon gets used if, for example, the possession of nuclear weapons violates the Lockean proviso by taking too much of a resource such that no one else can have it. And those are just some examples. But the point is, this is one way that I think if you are currently, stuck with your, I guess, status quo of what you like doing when you're a field debater, which for a lot of us is usually, um, I don't want to answer disadvantages. I want to say consequences fail. I want to just like win one page and then that's that. Then this is the shift you need to make. And we'll talk about it a little bit what the consequences of not making that shift might be in a second. Second option, and this is really my pitch for you all, and what I think would be I think a positive development for field debating is don't phrase your offense that way. This is going to require pretty big costs for all of us, which is that we might need to like actually even maybe put a modicum of work into answering a disadvantage. But what I wrote here is like most real people don't view consequentialism, yes, no, as like black and white. Everyone can always come up with some scenario that makes them feel uncomfortable being a pure consequentialist or not caring about consequences at all. And in real academic, philosophy, especially in ethics, a lot of people end up somewhere in between and make claims for maybe why we ought care more about consequences than anything else, but very often it'll be more of a balancing act than it is a black and white yes no question. And that's a little bit unfamiliar for, I think, how we approach field debate typically in LD, but it provides some serious advantages, most notably that most of the moral objections to nuclear weapons are not intrinsic to them. The criticisms of deterrence and the way that it makes us unethical subjects from like a virtue perspective or the coercion involved in it are really good and probably some of the best ethical objections to the possession of nuclear weapons. They're also, I think, pretty much definitionally not intrinsic to possessing nuclear weapons or to anything about nuclear weapons themselves. So, because of that, if you're willing to adapt your framework to debating a little bit, I think you get access to a lot more creative AF angles and better offense than you might normally. And unfortunately, I'm not really sure I can identify any affirmatives that I think fit into this category that I've seen, at least in my perusal of the wiki. Maybe I'm wrong about that, and if so, kudos to you. Um, but I think this is a way that you can really up your game and also get a little bit of a different angle. So this doesn't necessarily require abandoning your consequences fail arguments entirely. But maybe your 2AR sounds a little bit less like no consequences ever and more like here's why intent matters more. Or here's why you shouldn't be willing to make consequentialist sacrifices for the greater good. Don't violate individual liberties for the sake of maximum utility, which are like in real academic philosophy, most of what people are actually writing about. Very few people end up in like the Kant logic games that we end up doing in debate. And so you'll get access to more areas of the Phil library and I think be able to write some more reasonable strategic affirmatives. And I'll get a little bit more on how we do that on the next slide. So I'm gonna give I guess a secondary pitch for a way you can do this. And this is something that I think some schools have been approaching, but not, I think, quite in the most strategic way. So remember, philosophy is an entire academic discipline, and it constitutes, like you would call philosophers, many of the people that we commonly read in K debates. My big three examples here are psychoanalysis, Heidegger, and Derrida. And the reason why is because all of these kind of branches of philosophy are not like ethics necessarily, but have something to say about how we approach contemporary political problems and would provide a recommendation on the use of nuclear or the possession of nuclear weapons, probably all three to the negative, and offer you ways to kind of take some of that skill of criticizing consequentialism, of focusing on framework debates instead of, link defense to disadvantages, while, I think giving you a little bit more of that less relying on the intrinsic nature of weapons to garner your offense, because that's a really sticky situation to be in if the negative correctly objects that your offense is in fact also consequentialist. That gets you in trouble on the consequences fail debate if that's really your angle. So for reading an affirmative like this, the structure might look something like this. We've got a description of the world and humans' relationship to it. For the psychoanalysis K, it could be like a brief explanation of like Lacan's theory of desire. For Heidegger, you could have a in-depth analysis of the standing reserve as a concept and how it interacts with how humans relate to technology and nature. And then tie that to a reason the resolution is true, and then read your like, criticisms of consequentialism. This does change how your 1AR on the disad plus util plays out, though. So I think the kind of arguments that I would prioritize if I were reading an affirmative that is less like no consequentialism ever, would be like more traditional like criticisms of utilitarian reasoning. So one way you could criticize utilitarianism is by saying naturalism is bad, or by winning that consequences are an irrelevant way to calculate ethics. But you could just as easily, go for all the criticisms of how utilitarianism requires consequential sacrifices, how it can never proactively condemn any action as always bad, things like that, which I think are pretty common sense and are often going to appeal to judges who are not your like traditional like Phil brain rot judges. Um, Gives you kind of access to a little bit of a different part of the judge pool. I mean, if you have me in the back of the room, I'm all for voting on Mena and Five, but especially if you have, approaching the TOC and NDCA, which are, as I'm sure the people of you who participate in this style know, not typically tournaments with judging pools that are well constructed for Phil debate. Uh, Heidegger Phil Af lets you kind of speak their language a little bit. Similarly, you can go for some of the things that you like going for, like psychoanalysis, I think, is an excellent hijack of util in that it says what we consciously think we want and what we consciously think will increase our pain and pleasure is often in contradiction to what we end up doing because of the role of the unconscious. And that offers, I think, a pretty effective way to win that your framework resolves some ethical problem that utilitarianism can't, or is necessary for being able to do utilitarian reasoning. And you could construct a very good 1AR and 2AR on indicative util and a hijack plus a couple like top level metaphysical type arguments that criticize the utilitarian view of the world. Like, for example, I think Derrida's got a pretty good critique of binarizing anything, but especially pain and pleasure. There's some Derridians who write about util who I think have some good points about that. And so those can kind of turn into a whole different kind of framework to AR that still kind of achieves your objective of like, this is not a debate about yes, no deterrence, but does so in a way that's appealing to more judges and doesn't get you in this trouble of like, well, is my offense consequentialist or is it not? And on the next slide, I got more coming in that direction. Okay, so that's my brief AF pitch. Really, this topic so far from the Phil side has been like a couple of KFs and then a lot of Kant ACs with like one piece of offense that is actually intrinsic to nuclear weapons and the rest of them that aren't. A lot of 1ACs that are setting up to go for 1AR theory, which is fine. Everyone's got their style, but we could read some interesting substance Phil-AFs, and there hasn't really been a lot of that from my read of the topic so far. And that's a good way to get into it. On the negative side, I think the negative can debate a little bit more traditionally. It is pretty easy to disprove the necessity or the immorality of possessing nuclear weapons, which leads to my first point, which is moral skepticism. This is like one of my favorite arguments in debate. I'm like it so much that I've even tried to get college policy judges to vote on it. But part of the reason I think it's so strong on this topic is that generally it's pretty strange as it may sound, it's pretty easy to win that ethics don't exist. It's pretty easy to win that any ethical system falls into some pretty severe logical and practical problems that make it better to act as though there is no ethical system at all. It's kind of hard sometimes to win that means the negative wins. Skepticism is often viewed as a defensive argument, so that if there's a risk of the AF, then the AF should win. And this resolution is worded such that it makes your life as easy as possible to give that version of the two an R. I'll give it for you. The resolution says the possession of nuclear weapons is immoral. If we win skepticism, the possession of nuclear weapons is by definition not immoral. Vote negative. That's a lot easier than like an ought or a should resolution, because ought and should resolutions pose an action. And then what you do with that action is, I think, usually related to a moral obligation, but pretty easy to interpret as like comparing possible worlds or something like that. I think, at least for me, and I think for a lot of judges who like care about what the words in the resolution mean, saying something like comparative worlds paradigm doesn't really make any sense on a resolution that just does not ask about an action. And because of that, skepticism becomes a lot easier. So if you're winning substance skepticism, which hopefully you are, especially if you're debating against, maybe a util debater who's a little bit less familiar, then you can put yourself in a pretty good situation just by like defending what the words in the resolution mean. As for like traditional NCs, because of this like intrinsic problem with the resolution, a lot of fill frameworks are just going to be very easy to win that they negate. Like there's no pitch for Hobbes affirms on this topic because there would be no offense that's intrinsic to the possession of nuclear weapons. I think similar things are true for like the Locke negative that I was talking about as well. Like I just think it's pretty easy to win that these frameworks negate. So that changes our calculus, right? On other topics, where there's like pretty good AF angles, you might want to pick the thing you're most familiar with or the thing with the strongest answers to util. My pitch to you is going to be you should pick your NC, like the fill NC you put in your one NCs, basically starting and ending with can they get offense against it? If they can, it's a terrible choice. I think the best example of this, and I'm sorry if this offend some of your sensibilities, but I think Kant is a really poor negative choice on this resolution. There's an argument that Kant can make for the affirmative. I don't really know why you would opt into a debate where the affirmative can straight turn when there's so many options that they can't. So then, of course, then you want to care about something new, something that your opponent might not be prepared for, and having good answers to util. But I think that choosing an NC that the affirmative can straight turn like reasonably on this resolution is kind of a fumble. And so I would recommend against that. And similarly, there's not a lot going on this side so far, this topic. My read has been a lot of theory 1 and Cs, and then every once in a while some like, of our greatest hits like pragmatism, things that like always negate regardless of the resolution. But I think this is like a good setup for something like Hobbes or something that can really clearly negate, that gives you good inroads to skepticism. And I think it's a better choice than Kant, especially on this topic. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. I'm going to quickly talk about theory of eights in this resolution. Jasmine talked about the importance of T. I can't emphasize it more. This is going to be my little soapbox moment. T, whether you call it T subsets or T no spec or Nebel or whatever, really popular and being debated a lot on this topic. But here's I think an angle that's sometimes missing from these 1 and Cs and from AF strategies against this argument. So typically the way these debates play out is that the negative goes for semantics, and the AF goes for pragmatics, and the AF goes for, well, the whole res AF would be unwinnable, and no one advocates for it, and then picks are bad, and then the negative goes for, okay, but the words in the resolution ban specification, and then that's the impact calculus debate. This topic, I think, sets the negative up pretty well on both sides. And so this traditional adage of like, well, the negative goes for semantics and the AF goes for debatability or pragmatism, I think is not always accurate. And I think the negative is in a pretty good shape on either frame. So first, like, I think it's pretty impossible to read the words in the resolution as being provable via a subset. First, France should get rid of nuclear weapons. If that's your opponent's plan text, like France should disarm, that's just a plan text that has no connection to the resolutional statement. Winning that it would be a good idea if France disarmed has really nothing to do with whether the possession of nuclear weapons are immoral. But even if we write the plan a little bit better from the policy side, I think we're still in kind of a logical trouble here. The possession of nuclear weapons by France is immoral. To me, at least, and you might disagree, and if so, keep reading your apps, that is pretty clearly not proven by, or the possession of nuclear weapons is immoral, is not proven by the possession of nuclear weapons by France is immoral. And so because of that, I think the negative is like pretty clearly in the right on semantics, and can just win their like classic semantics outright. But similarly, like the way that the affirmatives are being written this topic, Russia gets rid of one particular type of nuclear weapons that it's going to use to like escalate in Ukraine. Doesn't seem like there's a particularly reasonable or at least good to debate case neg to that. Um, because the affirmative, if we logically say that the affirmative can specify country, there's no reason they also can't specify weapon. If we're already pretending that the words in the resolution don't matter, then the app gets to do whatever it wants. And so I think the negative has got like a really compelling limits case, a really compelling ground case. And all of that means that if the negative on this topic wants to go for the debatability stuff, they should. And a lot of 1NCs I'm not seeing, not a lot of 1NCs I'm seeing. Semantics outweighs, which is fine. Good strategy. I mean, I think pretty clearly semantically a correct reading of the resolution, but not the only way to approach it. I'm going to end with or end the theory section with just this grammatical interpretation of the words of the resolution. I think you can cut evidence to support this, but in the easiest terms possible, the resolution is expressing a general moral principle. It's not saying the possession of all nuclear weapons are immoral, clearly. It's also not saying the possession of any individual nuclear weapon is immoral. Instead, it's expressing a general principle about how the ethics of possessing a certain type of thing, and it should be read generally. What reading it generally means is that it's not proven by a subset, nor is it disproven by a subset. If I say, well, hold on, you said the possession of nuclear weapons are immoral, but don't you know that it's hypothetically possible we could use them to hit asteroids? Like that doesn't prove the possession of nuclear weapons is moral. Similarly, the app says, okay, the possession of nuclear weapons is clearly immoral. And to prove that, I'm just going to say that this particular subset of Russian missiles that they're using to, cause, red line escalation in Ukraine is really bad. Like neither of those seem to express a proof for the truth statement of the resolution. Similarly, arguments about the process of disarming don't really have any relation to the possession of nuclear weapons. So, my takeaways, at least on the theory side. First, go for debatability if you want. I think this resolution is set up well, and the way this resolution has been playing out, I think makes a limit story persuasive to a lot of judges. Second, if you are affirmative, you should get a theory argument ready, maybe even in the 1AC, that explains what negates the resolution and what doesn't. If you're worried about the pit stuffing counterplan, you can correctly point out that, that doesn't disprove the resolution because it doesn't prove the possession of nuclear weapons is moral. Similarly, rearmament, politics are all questions of hypothetical action, none of which have any relation to the resolutional statement. And so you could get rid of a lot of negative positions pretty quickly just by clever theory debating and interpreting the words in the resolution. And that's something I really haven't seen at all is AF teams with a theory underview, policy AFs even, that just say, hey, here's what the words in the resolution mean, and here's what's offense, and here's what's not offense. This is if you did traditional debate, this is what would traditionally be an observation. But they're useful, and they're useful in traditional debate because they screen out pieces of negative offense, and you can do the same here. And so if there's one thing you take away, especially if you're not a filler or theory person, from what I'm talking about right now, is I think these are effective ways to frame out negative offense. Similarly, if you're negative, if you want to read politics or rearmament in the 1NC, go for it. But if you're all in on winning that this is a valid way to negate the resolution, I think you're potentially in trouble. So all in all, I've got a little 4 takeaway slide that kind of takes this home. The first is, if you're saying you're not consequentialist and consequentialism always fails, but your offense is nuclear weapons, cause deterrence, and that's bad, you're going to lose to a smart util debater. So pick one of the 2 options we talked about and write a better affirmative. If you pick Kant, I think you're making a poor decision when you're negative. So think about why you want to read the NC you read. And if it's just familiarity and ultimately that's what you're the expert on, that's fine. But if you're thinking about it strategically, I think there are better options. This isn't a resolution that talks about a potential hypothetical action. So if you're a negative debater going for policy things, you might want to rethink how you're approaching negating policy affirmatives. And similarly, if you're affirmative, exploit that and frame out negative arguments. And finally, a lot of these things are just not how the resolution is being debated. Phil has been pretty one-dimensional and just kind of treating it like it's a normal action phrase resolution. Similarly, I think affirmative teams haven't been getting proactive on the theory debate and framing out pieces of negative offense. And so if you're looking at TOC strategy and you want a way to get ahead of your competition, try to innovate a little bit, adopt some new argument styles, think about the words in the resolution, counter define things in clever ways. And I think that sets you up to be successful, especially on a resolution that just is grammatically, logically, just a very different one than the ones we typically debate. That's what I have. I'm now ready for cross-sects.
All right, thank you so much. Before we jump into our Q&A, I want to remind people you can register for camp if you haven't yet. Rose and I and Castillo and I will all be at Flagship, and Castillo and Rose will be at NSD Texas. We also have NSD Philly, and we hope to see you all there. Shout out to our cat that is visiting Castillo right now on his screen. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and we will get into our Q&A. Thank you all for being patient. It's hard to, manage all of the Q&As and the questions like while we're in the middle of it, but now we are ready. All right. Let me see here.
I have a question we could start with that was sent in the webinar chat, not the Q&A, but Itri asks, what do you think is the best way to set up the win condition for SCEP? Do you think it's more strategic to read it as T burdens or phrasing it as a permissibility trigger with truth testing in the 1NC? Definitely not permissibility. I think that's a pretty big, even though permissibility negates is I think pretty truth true, you do not want to, make your debates yes, no permissibility affirmative negates. So that's, I think, the worst of those options. Similarly, I think you don't want your opponent to be able to theoretically object to skepticism. It's not the argument you could theoretically object to, or at least if you take seriously the words, the definitions of the words in the resolution that the negative wants to read in these debates, you shouldn't let them say negating this argument is unfair, so counterinterp as far as treating it as a T argument. So I think the best way to approach skepticism is to say truth testing and make it clear why it's a negation of the resolution. Importantly, this always needs to contain definitions of words in the resolution. This one, it's incredibly easy. Immoral means actively wrong. If immoral means actively wrong, then if it's not actively wrong, the resolution is false, so negative.
What about Chupang? There we go. All right, what about Chupang's question?
So I mean, some of them are these K style fill apps that I talked about earlier, but even this non-violent SAF that I think is, most people are calling it Kant, but just their offense is non-violent, I think has unique angles if you abandon the intrinsic nature of things. You can always just collapse to nuclear weapons are immoral because they're weapons and weapons are bad. But there's really good, evidence about what possessing a weapon does to your moral sensibilities, how it makes you more likely to pursue conflict. There's a lot of that scholarship in the context of the ethics of owning a gun, for instance. And I think you can apply some of those arguments in creative ways to disadvantages that maybe aren't they're not consequentialist, but they are in some way reliant on the effects of an action. And that's okay as long as you're not baking your entire framework strategy on that. You could also, Rawls is kind of a classic example of this. That framework cannot really say consequences fail credibly, but it's got great criticisms of util, and it's, I think, a very defensible framework and could probably affirm the resolution. So I think combining those affirmatives like that, you could also do soft fill like Levinas, although typically I don't find those that super strategic, but it's another, I think, good option if you're approaching apps like that. But also do your research. That's the whole point of debate. I'm sure you'll find interesting things if you want.
And Chris, if you want to hit us with some of the Q&A questions.
Samir is asking about 1ARs when reading a topical app, how they should be approaching skepticism. Do you have any thoughts on those things? I think something that just a general format of having some overview type arguments that can apply to skepticism broadly. That's where you will see kind of your independent voter type stuff. That's where you also might have a counter definition of what it might mean to be immoral. But I think if you want to be kind of competitive, if you're in a circuit where you are hit with these types of 1NCs a lot, I do think it is important to kind of dig into what are the common justifications that people are reading to actually understand individual warrants for skepticism. So we're not just treating all skeptical warrants the same, that we have unique ways of how we approach linguistic skep or external skep. So that's what I would advise is kind of having your top level of things that you are going to always say, and then just kind of start building up a file against like individual warrants because oftentimes they're not great, or sometimes they're just not like well explained. But the neg just kind of takes advantage of the fact that like the one AR to SCEP is just always the same. So that would kind of be my first kind of level of thinking is we actually need to dig into some of these individual warrants and cut answers to the things or write frameworks that assume those warrants, in addition to just having a good, efficient chunk on SCEP negates affirms. But as Rose pointed out, I think it's going to be harder to like win that like SCEP is not a win condition on this topic.
And really briefly, I think one great example of that is that a lot of the arguments that people pose are they're really arguments for some form of epistemic skepticism. So, like some reason we shouldn't be confident in our judgments about the world, which is at least, in my experience, like pretty meaningfully distinct from moral skepticism. Because the arguments of someone like, Sharon Street or J.L. Mackie or someone who disagrees with moral realism would be that we have like a pretty good reason to believe that ethics does not exist and that we're all making this up when we say X is good or bad. Linguistic and external world skeps are reasons we should be doubtful about our knowledge of the world, not really, I think, proactive reasons why we can know that morality doesn't exist. So against those kind of arguments, I think arguments like, well, there's a risk we're right can become pretty persuasive because a lot of skep warrants don't like really neatly line up to the conclusion that they're being used to justify, which it kind of goes hand in hand with like figuring out what you're actually debating and then defending your framework.
All right, some questions from the Q&A that I'll hit us with. Someone is asking about how they should adapt at the Pennsbury Falcon Invitational. The judge pool is half lay and half circuit, and this student is reading a soft left set call KF. What are our suggestions based on the judge pool and how they should strategize? I feel like Chris, you're gonna have and probably Rose some good tips on like adapting to an audience like that when you're reading like a soft left AF in front of like some parents and all of that.
I think it's good to approach a tournament like this as your job is to kind of develop a AF narrative that does not shift too much from debate to debate when you are debating in front of like the non-technical part of the tournament. Like I think people really get into dangerous waters when they start trying to over adapt to a judge. I think what you want to do is just kind of figure out what is kind of the baseline AF story that you feel is most compelling, and then stick to that same 1AR and 2AR template so that we're not trying to reinvent 2AR every lay debate. We instead know that every 2AR needs to have these three elements, and then we feel good about those three elements. It's probably like a personal preference, but I think it is good to have like an app that requires very little change from a more technical judge to a lay judge, to the point where like the differences should probably come down to just like highlighting and like extra cards, but like the core position should not radically change. I think it's just best to kind of have like a consistent story that you're selling or that you're using throughout the tournament, and you don't have like these wide variances. And when you're especially getting into out rounds and you're trying to like split panels and figure out how do I pick up these two judges and this judge, if you're kind of going to the debate, going to the tournament, having a pretty clear list of like these are the modifications that I'm going to make. It's mostly going to be at the level of speed and depth of explanation, and it's not going to be like I'm reading entirely different prep from round to round. For soft left stuff, I think that is pretty compelling for that type of judge pool. I think you just need to be prepared to debate like the deterrence dissent, as we talked about a lot, and be able to kind of win those debates substantively so that you don't get into like debates about like complex frameworks where you're trying to say it is consequentialist or it's not consequentialist. I think you need to be prepared to kind of go head on into clashes with negative arguments. So be prepared to have like a 1AR that straight up answers deterrence as opposed to just tries to use framing. So, those are the tips that come to mind.
Yeah.
And I would add that you don't need the K words, even in front of the K judges, to explain like concepts about colonialism. And if you're trying to split a panel, it's pretty difficult to, if your AF is like written and highlighted such that that's like a pretty big part of your AF explanation, then I think you could be in trouble trying to talk to two different groups of people at once. And so if you just write your normal version of the affirmative to be more set up to just like use common language that maybe my grandma would understand if she was judging you, you're probably in a better place.
All right, we got a lot of good questions in the Q&A to get through. All right, so this one's for Rose. Do you think cont AFs are strategic given that the neg could also read cont negates?
Yeah, I mean, like Kant is always a strong argument, mostly because of how familiar judges are with it. So it's a pretty good way. I mean, I typically have students read it because it's a way to get judges who not a super, fill verse, but have like been around LD that this is the thing that they'll know. Um, the fact that there's an egg doesn't really concern me a lot. What would concern me if because, it's a debate. Sometimes you have to debate. Um, the thing that I think maybe would concern me a little bit more is that if your Kant offense isn't really Kant offense, like a lot of the Kant affirmatives I've been seeing are kind of relying really heavily on this pacifism offense, and I'm not sure that's like super consistent with the framework that's being read because I think you can read some pretty good Kantian justifications for like the idea that violence or the possession of a weapon can be okay. And so I think Kant is fine. I would maybe tailor my Kant offense a little bit more to your framework, or select a framework like this pacifism framework that is more set up to go well with your offense. But Kant, I think, will always be strategic. It's also pretty good against the K, which I find useful.
What are some examples of the B-type fill cases, like the stop saying intrinsic?
I think I answered that question.
Yeah, I think we got through that. Okay. If the app doesn't establish no subsets in the 1AC, can the neg say must defend all scenarios and spread as many examples of how possession could be moral and say the app must rebut all of them or negs prove not immoral? If I understand this correctly, I think like what I would say is like it's a question of should, not could. Like, could you do that? Like, yeah, but should you do that? I don't know. Rose, what do you think?
Uh, if so, it really depends on how they're framing this argument. Like, if you stand up and you say nuclear weapons are immoral, and you're not going to like nuclear weapons are moral. Here's 7 scenarios where they're good. I cannot think of any theoretical objection to that. I mean, that's just listing disadvantages for the resolution. I would then weigh my AF against them and answer them. If they're saying nuclear weapons are moral in this instance, and this instance, and if I win one of those instances, that's all that matters, then whether or not they're labeling is that them as that or not, those are picks, and I think you should approach them like that. And I think there's a pretty compelling resolutional case to be made that they do not compete nor disprove the resolution.
Mhm. Someone asked, Jasmine, what unique angles can FemIR take that can't be accessed by normal security slash Orientalism IRKs? Yeah, that's a really good question. The short and sweet answer is like it just adds like a very strategic level of specificity to Orientalism like and security. So like FemIR scholars are often in conversation with like regular security case scholars and like authors who write like Orientalism like K cards and stuff like that. So like there is a lot of overlap in terms of just how those Ks are structured. But the reason why FemIR is so strategic is because the specific responses to FemIR are just not great. Like the cards that answer it are just are not good. Like the literature imbalance, I think, is like so skewed. And trust me, I have cut and I've tried to cut many answers to FemIR, and even the best cards that I can find are not amazing. Like they're still not as good as the FemIR cards themselves. So like in many ways, FemIR is not doing like radically different things compared to the other Ks you mentioned, but there's just such a level of specificity that other teams are like not prepared, to answer. Like they're not prepared to have a debate like about like gender essentially. And so there are just lots of different links that I think you can find from those literature bases, from like feminist literature bases that you like really can't find on like normal security, and also just like the impact level too. So like the cards that are like hegemonic masculinity like causes war, like those cards are really good and they have like data and evidence and case studies to back those things up. Whereas like for the normal security K, you're often kind of going for a vague like endless war style impact, which isn't bad by any means, but like in my opinion, I like the specificity of being like hegemonic masculinity causes endless cycles of war making. Here's data and case studies to like back all this stuff up. But yeah, really good question. Let's see. Got a lot of things in the Q&A. Chris, also feel free to type answers if you see some questions that you want to answer so we can get through a bunch. For a lot of the AF philosophers that you mentioned, Rose, especially Heidegger, how can they best defend against the, K's of Heidegger in particular?
So I can only speak from my perspective. I've never found these arguments particularly persuasive, and I can maybe talk about why, and hopefully that'll give you some insight on how to answer these arguments. I think it seems totally logically consistent with me to say that Heidegger's critique of the standing reserve is epistemologically valid and an important contribution to modern philosophy, and also that his contemporary political beliefs were bad and was an awful human being, obviously. I think a lot of those things are mitigated by like not being super reliant on like the great man Heidegger and just like citing the idea because I think it's hard to defend that ideas are irreparably tainted by the people who presented them. However, if you're like Heidegger's important contributions to philosophy, and I love this guy Heidegger, and man, I'm labeling my app Heidegger on the wiki, and I love Heidegger, then these arguments start to become a little bit more persuasive. Second, remember that like K's are K's, like I don't know, go for framework, be like, this is not a reason to vote negative. This doesn't negate the AF. Especially if these are like more soft, they're not soft left, they're like fill AFs that are from the resolution. I think sometimes it's easy to forget that author indites only negate under a very particular frame for what debate looks like, and that's a frame that the AF can object to. Finally, if this is phrased as an independent voting issue, you should point out that the debate is pretty consistently reliant on citing scholarship that is from similarly problematic people. Like all these nukes people are like at some point going to reference some of the foundational realist texts who often trace like their philosophical origins back to Hobbes, who was arguably a worse person than Heidegger was, and certainly his writing and his ideas were worse. So I think like at the end of the day, debate no one is safe from the ideological stain of citing people who have thought bad things at some point in time. And so pointing that out, I think, helps push back against what might be an initially persuasive push to some judges.
All right, Ben, you raised your hand. Oh, someone else raised their hand. I don't know if you're going to be able to ask on that, but I did. Let's see. I did technically answer them. Okay. Rose, why do you think Levinas isn't strategic?
More a personal hot take than something I would take as a reason to not read the argument. Personally, I don't think it's good against util or the K. Like it's typically read as a fill af that's like got a unique angle on the K. I actually, to me, I think the critiques of but because Levinas is more on the left, like he's like a left or philosopher, that he's being criticized a lot more. It's the kind of the same logic as like the leftists write more critiques of Biden than Trump. It's like kind of a similar thing. Like he's closer to like the post-colonial theory, to the settler colonial theory, to anti-blackness scholarship, and so they just write better critiques of him than they do of Kant because it's kind of assumed that if you're doing like post-colonial theory that we're not a fan of Kant. So I don't think it's actually better against the K than Kant is, and I think its link turn is less persuasive. And I think it's just pretty clearly worse against Util because I don't think it's got a compelling answer to it's consequentialist framework that doesn't have a super compelling answer to extinction outlays. But that is really my hot take. I also am not a big fan of the philosopher. I just really don't think he's that interesting. But do what you like.
Do fill afs with offense based on the definitions of weapons need to answer disads? If it's a fill af, yeah.
Depending on your framework. So this is the benefit of if you want to like really be stuck to no, vote affirmative because the possession of nuclear weapons is intrinsically immoral. Like if you're saying, look, consequences are totally morally irrelevant and we should not care at all, then those arguments just patently do not disprove the resolution under that frame. Like No amount of saying, but bioweapons are also bad proves that the possession of nuclear weapons are immoral, unless you win that consequentialism is valid ethically. So, have to, no. I think if you want to read one of these more middle ground, then I think you might need to do a little bit more engagement, but that engagement could include like, there's like very good philosophical criticisms of the idea of the lesser of two evils and why, the fact that there is a bad alternative does not make it okay to use or possess something as bad as a nuclear weapon. So no one has to answer any argument. I think it's a good idea with some affirmatives, and with some affirmatives, you should just focus on the framework debate.
Gotcha. And let's see, Jeffrey asked, how should a 1AR framework versus the K look like if there is no plan? By no plan, I'm going to assume we just mean like upholding the resolution. Chris, is that what I should assume Jeffrey means? Okay. Well, in that case, like it doesn't really change all that much. I mean, like the wording of your interpretation on framework and all of that, but I mean, you're going to be probably reading a little bit of truth testing, right? Like versus the critique if you're truly just like upholding the resolution as like a moral statement. I don't know if Rose and Chris have additional thoughts there, but
Truth testing.
yeah.
I actually think it might be a good idea for untraditional policy resolutions, policy affirmatives to be saying truth testing against the K. And this resolution,
Mhm.
it's just, I think clearly, if you end up saying something like interpretation, way, consequences, plan, you're like off to the wrong start.
Mhm. Someone asked a question for an anti-blackness AF. Do you think it would be more strategic to make an ontology or metaphysics claim and fiat disarm, or an alternative method than just make a descriptive claim of racism and nukes in the squo? If I were you, if I were trying to write like a topical like anti-blackness affirmative, you don't need to mess with ontology or metaphysics whatsoever, and I would not because that gets you into a lot more baggage, and you don't have to deal with it, right? Like you don't have to win that there's like a metaphysical structure that determines literally everything in order to win that like nuclear weapons are like obviously racist, both in terms of their consequences and in the way that they are, like formed and all of that. There, yeah, lots of ways to just argue that nukes are bad for like consequences reasons and for just like, yeah, they are racist. So yeah, if I were you, I wouldn't mess with ontology at all. And then similarly, someone asked how would going for ontology of certain bodies in the nuclear state and SQUO matters more than extinction and deterrence? Like, what would that look like as an AF? Cross apply my above answer. You don't need to win an ontology argument, but for impact framing, if you're trying to win that like a form of structural violence outweighs, a lot of the normal stuff that here like applies. Like, what do we know about nuclear weapons? Well, if we know what we should all know about the history of nuclear weapons and the present day use of nuclear weapons, we know that they are used in extremely racist and colonial and gendered and violent ways. Like that is the history of nukes, right? And so those cards kind of like fall like from the sky. And nuclear weapons in terms of like preventing extinction and all of that. There are plenty of cards that critique that very notion that you should try to get your hands on. But yeah, you just got to win why judges should care more about that. Like, why should we care more about, like, for example, the effects of nuclear testing on indigenous populations more so than the possibility of preserving like American hegemony or something like that? You just have to do like those types of weighing comparisons. Um, let's see. How can Rose is typing. I'll let you do that. And that similarly answers, I think, the question about like nuclear apartheid arguments. You just want to find some framing cards about why those like arguments, why those impacts like matter more. Yeah.
I clicked the wrong button. How can Kant asks answer that offense isn't intrinsic to mere possession, even if the weapons themselves are violent, because intent isn't falsifiable? Um, if what I understand what you're asking is the negative could object to Kant saying their offense is intrinsic to possessing nuclear weapons by saying, well, we don't ever know the intent of an action. Um, I'm not sure that that responds to offense that is actually intrinsic to the possession of nuclear weapons. For example, a Kantev could define the word weapon to say that the possession of a nuclear weapon is a coercive act. And it doesn't matter what the intent. I think this is a common misconception about Kant, is that he's really super concerned about intent. He is concerned about intent when it comes to like whether or not you have done something morally praiseworthy, as in if you're doing something for the sake of duty rather than like doing it because it feels good, then you're doing a better action. But as far as determining which actions are wrong and right, it actually has nothing to do with what you intend. It has everything to do with the intrinsic nature of an action. And a Kontaf could effectively argue that the intrinsic nature of possessing a nuclear weapon is immoral. But I think the important objection this raises is that a lot of the Kontaf offense isn't intrinsic to possessing a nuclear weapon. It is an argument that the possession of nuclear weapons creates a state in the world whereby other immoral actions occur or people are put in a situation that is not morally permissible. And those will require a little bit of a different way of approach to consequentialism, but are far more persuasive offense, I think, than having a weapon is always wrong.
All right. What should the 1AR enable T be against T subsets? And the 1 and C's interp usually includes the neg may not read pics. What should the 1AR do if the 1 and C interp excludes the reading of both subsets on the F and the neg?
But for me, Af ground. Pix is like, I think, yeah, I think the negative is like pretty, at least to me, pretty factually correct that if their reading of the words of the resolution are correct, then Pix also no negate. I also think their reading of the words in the resolution is probably the closest to like grammatical truth. The best AF argument is that multiple AFs are good because AF innovation is good, stale debates over one whole res AF are bad, and the negative gets to prep out one AF incredibly well. I think that's a compelling story, totally defensible, and I think can speak to judges' hearts about liking unique and creative affirmatives and not liking stale debates, which might be creative if we only have one AF all topic.
Any arguments on how bioweapon extinction is obsolete? If I'm interpreting this question correctly, and feel free to jump in if I'm not, it seems like you're trying to ask like why bio extinction via bioweapons is like not really a thing anymore. The way you would answer that, I guess, is just by being like, A, there we have like chemical weapons like have been used like in warfare already. And like ergo, we are all still alive. Obviously, many people were absolutely harmed by those chemical weapons, but certainly not to the extent of extinction. And that is just like empirically proven. There's also like so many issues with bioweapon acquisition. When you're answering bioweapons like impacts, you should like read cards that describe all the hurdles and obstacles that a terror group or I guess a state would have to go through in order to like acquire and to use bioweapons like successfully. It's pretty hard to answer those warrants. Yeah.
Also, remember, when we say the word bioweapons, we usually mean genetically engineered viruses and diseases. The disease defense answers bioweapons like 90% of the time. The burnout, what's the word for how burnout mortality trade-off? Island nations is really hard for them to answer. Like, I don't know that the disease would be capable of reaching places that are unaffected by a bioweapon conflict. Maybe no one's launching a bioweapon attack at Tuvalu. They could keep people out. So, like, I think disease defense, although you might want the cards to be specific, is like really persuasive and easy.
Mm-hmm. For the discussion regarding FemIR, do we have recommendations for philosophers to create more of a K fill? Like I think a K of fill, I think is what they mean. For that, I mean, oh gosh, there's so many different philosophers to look into, like feminist critiques of like philosophers. Yeah, that's not going to be like FemIR, because like FemIR scholars are talking about like international relations, like hedge and war and like all that stuff. But like for philosophy, oh goodness, you can. There's a good like I think Sarah Ahmed article about like Kant. She critiques, but like really, if you go into Google Scholar and just type in like feminist critique of X philosopher, you will find it. Like you will find so many things. Also, you can search like the wiki or like the what's it called? The wiki thing where people like post their like descriptions of what they have on the wiki. I forget the name. There are a lot of like backfile cards, I think, from Harvard Westlake. We used to do that a lot. Okay. Against PhilAfs, how do negatives normally respond to consequentialism indicts like butterfly effect, end states, and induction? Also, hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Caitlin. So I can answer how they should. Then normally what the negs do is say, we would obviously stop calculating and then stop talking, so realistically, if you're like, what should I prepare to have answered? The negative will say, like we can pragmatically get around that problem. It's not a serious enough problem. The more maybe sophisticated version of that argument is that no, ethics is a certain enterprise. Like we're never gonna, know for sure what the intent behind an action are. Every ethical system relies on defining words and identifying words with concepts, which is itself an intersubjective, subjective process. What means nuclear weapon to me might not mean nuclear weapon to you, all those things. So objections that are like, well, it might be difficult to calculate consequences don't really seem to get to the question of whether we should try to do that. And if we should try to do that, and if it's an important approach to ethics, then we should do it. So if you're affirmative and you want to answer these arguments, I think the step you need to take is to win that these are not just reasons why calculating consequences are hard, but why it actively leads to bad moral decisions. You mess up calculating the butterfly effect, and then you accidentally kill a baby that isn't Hitler or something like that.
Oh no. Someone asked, what is the best way to go for a Baudrillard aff / is it a viable strategy? I'm gonna assume you mean like a non-topical Baudrillard aff. Correct me if that's not what you mean, but yeah, like it's always possible. If I were you, I wouldn't read like evidence directly from Mr. Baudrillard. I would read scholars who are citing Baudrillard, and kind of like using his ideas, to make their own arguments. The reason why I start with that is because there are really good K links to Baudrillard himself. He's not like, he's not like a heinous guy to like defend or anything. But again, there are lots of, scholars from other sides of the library who were like, hey, he's like kind of gendered, might be kind of racist. So again, I would not read Baudrillard evidence directly. And then for like an aff, I guess generally, like, yeah, it's always possible. You can always read the same arguments about like communication, about information dissuasion. There's a lot of cards like that on nuclear weapons. I know that there are definitely like articles on like Baudrillard and nuke. So type that into Google Scholar. I think you'll find what you're looking for. Okay, how can you make an impact card for neg MAD / deterrent saying that MAD preserves world peace without becoming non-topical, without defending a world without nukes? Well, if I understand this correctly, you would still be topical. What you're describing is just reading impact defense against the affirmative. So if you're saying that mutually assured destruction, like prevents war, that's not like untopical or anything. That's just called, directly responding to the case. What you're saying with that is that nukes are not bad and that they don't escalate conflict or cause war because the existence of nukes is what prevents us from escalating, other conflicts and escalating like, conventionally. So you would not run into topicality problems, my friend. I'm a new circuit debater. What's the best way to learn how to write chaos? That's a really good question. First is that I would try to like find some examples of critical affirmatives on the wiki. There are lots of them out there. Do some digging, and I would just, read as many of them as I could and just try to get a sense of like how they're structured. There are also a lot of like lectures for those things online. So like I know just off the top of my head, the Dartmouth Debate Institute, they have like a lot of lectures like from their camp published online where they go in depth about like writing a KF. I'm sure there's some LD ones like out there as well, but like that's just one that I know off the top of my head. But I would say if you're a new circuit debater, I'm not trying to like dissuade you from writing a KF or anything, but I often think it's easier to start with other arguments, because it becomes a lot easier to develop like K skills when you know like exactly what you are K'ing. So oftentimes the best K debaters start out reading like policy arguments or Phil arguments, and then they're able to learn like, oh, here are all the flaws with like philosophical and like policy approaches. And so then they learn how to, deploy critical skills. So I would say start there. If you were my student, that's what I would tell you to do. But again, you can find so much free stuff on the wiki and on YouTube. Let's see. Go ahead. Yeah.
I can answer this last one. Well, then this is another last one. What should policy F1ARs read against truth testing? Okay, I agree with the second half of this conditional. Comparative worlds is kind of, I think, difficult to justify. It's really not based on readings of the words of the resolution, usually, and especially on this resolution. I mean, there's no worlds to compare. The resolution does not ask us to take an action. So answering truth testing to me seems difficult if your aim is to win that like fill positions like skepticism don't negate. I think the better plan is to, if you're worried about like nibs or like really silly, like, logic riddles that are like designed to like waste everyone's time, then I think your best option is to read a framework like normative truth testing, which says that the AF's job is to prove that the resolution is normatively true and the resolution is normatively false for the negative, which would then exclude arguments that prove the resolution true as like a semantic linguistic statement. And it's pretty easy to defend that because it meets all the jurisdiction stuff that the negative wants to say, while you could say not wasting everyone's time with like Zeno's paradox every debate. Um, but yeah, I mean, if your job is to say this debate is only about whether AF is like the AF plan is better than the world that the negative responds, I don't have great advice for you. Except for to say you can just really lead into arbitrariness does not matter. This is just a better interpretation for debate. Phil is bad. Not super persuasive to me, but there are definitely people who you could speak their language and get a ballot or two on that.
All right. And what about fill NCs against soft left AFs?
I like it. It kind of depends. Really, uh, the you should think about the way these debates are going to play out is that the AF is very, very rarely going to have a framework debate in a traditional sense with you. Like these AFs don't have meta ethics. Normally, the debaters who read them are reading them probably because they're not super interested in having a meta ethics debate. Um, and so like they're very strategic. You should remember that the 1AR is probably going to be a K of Phil and not really a substantive engagement on like a meta ethics hijacks level. That's not universally true. Certainly debaters who disprove that, but that would be my intuition as to what you're likely to expect. And so it's really strategic, but you have to prepare for it differently. And so I wouldn't choose a framework that's easier to K because you should enter the debate feeling pretty confident that you probably have more experience or at least are more prepared for a field debate. And so probably don't read like Hobbes, because then they'll just be like, that's super messed up, and they'll have a decent point. And maybe instead try to read like a little bit more of a defensible philosopher. But I think they're a great choice and are really good at punishing, I think, affirmatives that are typically not set up to answer them.
Rose, on that note, like, do you think that it's more strategic for people to invest in just like skep on the neg against those apps? Like, obviously the skep is very
Uh,
Kable, but like if they're gonna have to like defend something anyways, you know? Hmm.
I think the mechanics of what you need to win and lose change. So like this resolution, I think most of the negative negates arguments are just going to be something like skepticism. They're going to be like, well, it's impossible for just possessing something to be immoral, therefore vote negative. Um, to me, skepticism is kind of worse against soft left compared to like a normal fill NC because like you can always beat a framework by winning that framework is wrong. Like if you just like win a bunch of indicts to like whatever structural violence framework they have, that will prove that whatever framework you provide is better. And I think generally you just want to present the negative with as affirmative with as little things to criticize. And so reading like SCAP warrants to just like answer their framework, answer consequentialism when induction fails, and then say that's why you should use this other framework allows you to, I think, not have to say, I know you said all these bad things were happening to marginalized communities, but no one cares about that really, which I think is a harder place to be than just winning a pretty defensible framework like Kant.
And I would say all of that is just hyper judge dependent. I think
Yeah.
judges have will have different kind of be receptive to different arguments. Whereas that does run against like certain judges will just kind of think that the K of the app is that the K of skepticism is just true. So if you don't have like two NRs prepped out against that argument, or you cannot like figure out how to like answer that question in cross-examination, then you probably shouldn't read it. But if you think those things through and there's research to support these things, and these are obviously debates people have won, then you should feel comfortable pursuing it if you have the right judge. But it is important to think through those things differently, especially like cross-examination. I see that as like a place where so many people just kind of collapse, and the K is just kind of gift wrapped going into the 1AR. So I think you just need to think through those two NRs, think through cross-examination, and just make sure you have the right type of judge for it.
For example, I know Jasmine told me that she really loves when people go for skepticism against self-left apps. So that should be your primary strategy in front of her in the future.
For everyone at home, that was a joke, but yeah, I will vote on Scap. I don't feel a type of way about it anymore. All right, we're getting down to the bottom of the barrel
Um,
here. Yeah,
Counterpoints negate
counterpoints
on this
negate.
topic. If you go down to the answered section on Q&A, I already wrote a little answer to a very, very similar question. So you should go
Mm-hmm.
check that out.
For this one, on policy, how would you justify deterrence against things that can't be deterred, such as terrorism, misfires, and testing? That's a good question. I think overall, what you would say is that deterrence theory cannot like literally explain or like theoretically like deter literally everything, but it raises the costs and it raises the stakes for certain things like testing and misfires. So, for example, you could argue that deterrence, the logic of it, means that states are really cautious about doing like new nuclear testing or about like, just like, yeah, shooting one of their nukes off randomly as like a misfire because they understand that the stakes of that are extremely, like extraordinarily high. For terrorism, yes, that is like one of the like big debates with deterrence theory, which is that like you can't like deter irrational actors. But I think you could argue that, like, sure, non-state actors might be like a little bit like irrational, but they're not like that irrational. Like, they pay attention to these things and they like think about strategy and like, how these things all work. But yeah, you would just say that like deterrence theory doesn't like explain every single thing, but it raises the stakes and it dampens conflict overall. And there are, yeah, lots of cards for that.
And finally, the most persuasive warrants for truth testing. I am not a big jurisdiction fan personally. I don't think there's any rule that defines what the judge's jurisdiction is as relates to the resolution. And I think generally, non-truth testing leaders have gotten pretty good at explaining that. Uh, Fairness. Debates about the truth of the resolution are what we all came to do. It's the most predictable. It's the only thing that ensures good, even, half, and neg ground. Any other interpretation means the neg wins for very silly reasons, like one of your authors said a bad thing once, or you accidentally highlighted a word that you shouldn't have in a card. Those things create unfair burdens for the affirmative and give the negative too much ground. Or if you're negative, those things make it too easy for the aft to win. Um, and yeah, like I think the best justification for truth testing is not exactly the same, but very similar as what your play and focus justification would be. It's just like, this is what we came here to debate. It is what is predictable. Anything else is unfair. And fairness impact calc to me is more persuasive than jurisdiction impact calc.
Agreed. All right, so that's about the end for our webinar. Thank you to everybody who came out. We hope to do some more of these in the future, so please spread the word. As Jasmine said, registration is open for NSD flagship and satellites. Good luck, everybody. Go
Good
do
luck
good
this
stuff.
weekend. If you
Bye.
have
Good
like
luck.
any particular requests for future webinars, you're welcome to email me. My emails are my paradigm. A lot of you kids already have my email. Feel free to hit me up for those requests. Yeah, who knows? We may do one on your requested topic. Good luck this weekend, especially if you were in one of our labs. But yeah, hope to see everyone like this summer and have so much fun.